All right, let's jump into chapter 2 here. I loved this chapter. As I was saying in the first episode, in the foreword to The Lord of the Rings second edition, Tolkien writes about how this was the earliest part of what he wrote of the Fellowship of the Ring, that this was finished way before like 1939, even before the Hobbit was published, which I think was in 1937. So this is the oldest part of the Fellowship of the Ring. And of everything I've read so far in the book, I'm a few chapters ahead of this. This is my favorite chapter so far. And not a lot technically happens, yet it's still fascinating to me. So basically they set it up to where 17 years pass since the events of the first chapter. Gandalf has kind of come and gone from the Shire a few times in between those years, but right around 9 years before we catch up to the current day, Gandalf has not appeared at all. It's been almost an entire decade since he has shown up in the Shire. There are lots of rumors going around about trouble outside of the Shire. There's rumors of war, there's rumors of dark days ahead and crazy things that are coming. But for most of the people here, they don't really worry about that. They don't really think about that. There's a great scene where Sam Gamgee is sort of going back and forth with Ted, who's the son of the miller, who Sam Gamgee's father has a problem with. They went into that a little bit in chapter 1. He doesn't really like the miller. So Ted, the miller's son, is sort of, going back and forth with Sam about rumors that he's heard, and Ted's, dismissing them and making fun of him a little bit. Not like in a super bad way, but they're just kind of going back and forth and, well, what about this and what about that?
I can hear fireside tales and children's stories at home if I want to. No doubt you can, retorted Sam, and I dare say there's more truth in some of them than you reckon. Who invented the stories anyway? Take dragons now. No, thank ye, said Ted. I won't. I heard tell of 'em when I was a youngster, but there's no call to believe in 'em now. There's only one dragon in Bywater, and that's green.
Elves are coming through, and Mr. Frodo says this. Oh, he's cracked. He's going crazy. So there's some hints here at a foreshadowing of dark days coming, and people just kind of ignoring that or not wanting to believe it. And then Gandalf does show up again, and basically tells Frodo everything that he's learned in the last 17 years about the ring, and about the fact that he's tracked down Gollum in that time, and that it's now time to get the ring out of the Shire because Sauron and his agents now know that the ring is in the Shire, and they know that a person named Baggins is the one who has it, and they're probably coming there or making way there, ready to come after him at this point. So that's basically what happens. They also test the ring. They throw the ring in the fire, and they see the script, the letters that show up in red around it. So that's basically all that happens in this chapter. There's not a lot, but there is a ton of information, and I liked it quite a bit. So the first thing I took a note on here. This is mostly just making note of a difference from the movie, since we're doing a podcast on the films.
Folco Boffin and Fredegar Bolger were two of these, but his closest friends were Peregrine Took, usually called Pippin, and Merry Brandybuck.
In the movie, it didn't make it seem like... It made it seem like they were acquaintances or that they knew each other. Obviously, Merry and Pippin were at the party. But it doesn't really make it out like they're like best friends or closest friends or something like that. So I kind of thought that was an interesting difference. Another big difference, obviously, is the time scale we're talking about here. 17 years after the party is when Frodo learns these things and then makes plans to leave the Shire. In the movie, they don't really clarify the time, but it could be months later, maybe even weeks later, maybe a year, but it certainly doesn't feel like 17 years. They definitely heighten the urgency with which Gandalf sets out to try to learn what's going on and then comes back and gets him out. In the book, they go much, much slower through this. And again, this is something that I agree with as a change for the movie version. I think for the movie version, it's important for the pacing of the film to get the journey going and to really do that through a strong sense of urgency, which comes in this scene, which is they're coming right now. There's no time to plan. They're like, it's immediately urgent that you leave, like today, right? And I like that. I think that again sort of like gets everything moving in a way that a movie needs to. But they also set this up in the novel in a way that makes a lot of sense, right? And it makes sense in both versions. Like if it is that the Nazgul, the Black Riders, are literally on your doorstep, then there's no amount of planning is gonna matter. You need to just get out now. But in this version, they're not really sure about the movements of the enemy. They just know it. They need to get moving soon. And so what you don't want to do in a situation like that is create a scene with your disappearing act like Bilbo did, and then everyone's talking about it. And, these enemies come in and they start asking questions and, people are talking about it. You don't want that. So they try to create a cover story that makes sense. He's going back to Buckland, which is where he was raised as a child. Frodo was. He's buying a house out there, selling Bag End, making a believable story as for why he's leaving, so that when he ends up leaving the Shire, it won't be this immediate, thing that people are talking about, and they can throw off the tracks of anybody who comes around asking questions, at least for a little bit. So again, I like both versions of it, but Merry and Pippin were very close friends. And Pippin actually travels with Frodo when he does this move. So they set everything up. They're getting ready to sell Bag End. This is kind of more the next chapter, but Pippin is the one that travels with him as they're going to his new house in Buckland. I liked this too. And I think I had been asked by Dude McGuy in a message on Discord if in the film analysis we could talk about some of the differences between Frodo in the novel versus Frodo in the films, like differences in his character. So I'm trying to pay attention to that as I'm going through this as well. And just one note that I had relatively on that, one thing people bring up all the time, Frodo's supposed to be much older. He's supposed to be 50 years old when he sets out on the journey in the novel. In, the movie, Elijah Wood was maybe 18 when they were filming this, so he looks way too young, right? He's too young. However, this line here, I think, gives some credence to the fact that he looks very young in the movie, too.
As time went on, people began to notice that Frodo also showed signs of good preservation. Outwardly, he retained the appearance of a robust and energetic hobbit just out of his tweens.
So, because he got possession of the ring on his birthday where he came of age. Now, for hobbits, that age is 33. For human beings, that's 18, right? You're depends on which country you're in. But anyways, 18 is typically considered, adult age, coming of age, right? And so he preserved the look, the youth that he had when he came of age at 33. So it actually makes a lot of sense that he looks young in the movie, because the second he comes in possession of the ring, he's basically frozen in time, so to speak. He's supposed to look that way as long as he's in possession of the ring. So I think it works for the movie, at least in that aspect. So I talked last time about how I was trying to take note of Tolkien's prose and whether or not it becomes overly expository or verbose, or it goes on and on explaining details that aren't necessary. I'm still not seeing that at this point. But he does a good job at I feel like, in a really succinct way, sort of giving this idea of passages of time. Like we're moving 17 years ahead, and it doesn't feel like we've just cut and we're 17 years ahead. He does a really good job of sort of like explaining in sort of the in-between years how Frodo's disposition is changing. This paragraph here.
He began to say to himself, perhaps I shall cross the river myself one day. To which the other half of his mind always replied, not yet.
So he's starting to get this yearning to leave the Shire, to go out and explore the world, but there's another half of him that just doesn't feel ready for that. And that part of himself, I feel, at least in my reading so far, is a little bit stronger than Bilbo's was. Bilbo had some resistance in The Hobbit to leaving, but I think the stronger part of him wanted to go. And Frodo, it takes a really long time. In fact, it takes Gandalf essentially not giving him much choice before he decides to leave. And so he's not quite as eager to get out there. He has a part of himself that seems a little more conservative on that side than even Bilbo was. But Frodo starts to wander a little further, and just, walking through the wild, sort of exploring the Shire. He comes across elves. He sees them more often, leaving and not going back. Something doesn't seem right. I like the little, I don't know what you'd call it, banter back and forth between Ted and Sam. I love this passage where it says that it seemed that Ted had scored a point.
But this one was as big as an elm tree and walking 7 yards to a stride. If it was an inch, then I bet it wasn't an inch. What he saw was an elm tree as like as not. But this one was walking, I tell ye. And there ain't no elm tree on the North Moors. Then Hal can't have seen one, said Ted. There was some laughing and clapping. The audience seemed to think that Ted had scored a point.
Yeah, all of this is, again, it's not super long. It's not overly verbose. It's, I think, just right to give this sense of time passing. And I don't know, I just think it's cleverly written. I think it's witty. I think it's funny. It's engaging to read. And then this is when Gandalf reappears after his long absence, right? Basically, all of the information that is given in the short prologue of the films, actually more than that, is given here in this chapter. We learn everything about the rings of power, so the elven rings, the dwarven rings, the rings given to men, and then the One Ring. We learn all of that, which is like right at the beginning of Galadriel's monologue, right at the beginning of the movie. We get all of that lore here. We get the battle where Isildur cuts the ring from Sauron's hand. We get a lot more detail on Gollum. In fact, there are many lines from this chapter, chapter 2, that were repurposed in the film for way later in the story when they're in Moria. And Gandalf is trying to decide between which door to go through. He can't remember the way. And he speaks with Frodo a little bit about Gollum there. And, how it was pity that stayed Bilbo's hand. A lot of those lines from this chapter were repurposed for later in the story. Again, a choice I totally agree with for the film. I think that's the right time, kind of in the belly of the whale sort of moment of that movie for Gandalf to sort of instill some hope in Frodo. I really like the choice for moving that to there because you have to do that. You can't stay in this scene for as long in the film as you do in the novel, but all of that stuff is described here. It makes a lot of sense reading that, why this was the first chapter that he wrote in this novel. You could think about coming off of the back of The Hobbit, having finished that story, and thinking about, okay, what would I do to develop a sequel? You can basically see all of the setup, all the important exposition that would need to be given about the ring and all the context surrounding that and why the journey to destroy that ring is necessary. It's all given right here. And it makes a lot of sense that that was the first part of the story that was written. I liked this line here too about the resilience of Bilbo and just hobbits in general, as Gandalf is sort of assuming, right? That there's something about the quality or the nature of the hobbit spirit that is particularly resistant to the pull of the ring.
I think it likely that some would resist the rings far longer than most of the wise would believe. I don't think you need worry about Bilbo. Of course, he possessed the ring for many years and used it, so it might take a long while for the influence to wear off, before it was safe for him to see it again, for instance. Otherwise, he might live on for years quite happily, just stop as he was when he parted with it, for he gave it up in the end of his own accord. An important point. No, I was not troubled about dear Bilbo any more, once he had let the thing go. It is for you that I feel responsible.
So this is on the back of Frodo being concerned because Gandalf is describing the effects, both short and long-term effects, of possessing a ring of power, and in particular the one ring like this, for as long as Bilbo did. And so Frodo's like, well, what's going to happen to him? He's like, oh, I don't think you need to worry about him. So that's basically what he's doing there. I really liked this line where Gandalf basically expresses the sentiment that it would be a terrible shame, like a horrible loss or blow to the world, if the dark power overcame the Shire. And this only works, again, because I think the first chapter did such an excellent job at establishing the culture of the place and kind of helping you to fall in love and become ingrained in it, like I was saying last time. So once you've seen what the Shire is, this place of incredible peace and beauty and just a way of life that is simple, now we're introducing the threat to that. So the first chapter was all about building this sort of, I don't want to say idyllic necessarily or ideal, because of course, there's problems with it and some of the people are stupid and there's still a lot of gossiping and things like, it's not a perfect society. I'm not trying to make that case at all, but it's certainly one of the more peaceful places you could think of to live, right? And so Gandalf is talking about how terrible it would be if such a place were to come under the power of the Dark Lord.
Ever since Bilbo left, I have been deeply concerned about you, and about all these charming, absurd, helpless hobbits. It would be a grievous blow to the world if the dark power overcame the Shire, if all your kind, jolly, stupid Bolgers, Hornblowers, Boffins, Bracegirdles, and the rest, not to mention the ridiculous Bagginses, became enslaved.
So Gandalf has fallen in love with the place. I mean, that's obvious. He went there fairly often. He likes to smoke their pipeweed. He talks about how hobbits are fascinating to him. He says this later, because you can learn all there is to know about their ways in a month. So you could study hobbit lore and basically understand their history and their culture in more of a, secular academic sense. It won't take much time at all. But after 100 years, these people can still surprise you. So he has just taken this particular interest and love of hobbits and hobbit lore. I love how he describes it as being like a very obscure branch of knowledge, right? But it's just something that called to him. One of the most important and powerful people in this world that Tolkien has created just can't really resist the lure of the place. And so he feels really responsible for not only his good friends, Frodo and Bilbo, of course, but just for preserving that place, making sure that it's not lost. I found this really interesting, and it's different from the films. In the novel, it describes Frodo taking the ring out of his pocket and handing it on a chain, but handing it to Gandalf. He feels some reluctance to let him touch it. He's feeling that influence from the ring. But the important part to me is that in the film, Gandalf kind of reaches down towards the ring when it's on the floor, when Bilbo drops it. as if he's going to touch it, and then he's like, no, something feels off about it, like I shouldn't touch that. And then basically he has Frodo hand it to him in the envelope, and he closes the envelope, right, and hands it back to him. But he doesn't ever touch it directly. He does not touch the gold, the metal of the ring itself. He goes through great lengths to do that. And the only time it really comes close is when it's inside the envelope. He quickly stamps it and gives it back to him, or seals it and gives it back to him. Here he actually asks Frodo to hand it over to him.
Give me the ring for a moment. Frodo took it from his breeches pocket, where it was clasped to a chain that hung from his belt. He unfastened it.
So he unfastened the chain
And handed it slowly to the wizard. It felt suddenly very heavy, as if either it or Frodo himself was in some way reluctant for Gandalf to touch it. Gandalf held it up.
It's not on the chain, I don't think. He's holding it in his hand.
It looked to be made of pure and solid gold. Can you see any markings on it? He asked.
In the film, Gandalf used like tongs to. He took the envelope that the ring was in, and he tossed it into the fire, and then he uses some tongs to like pick it up, but he puts it in Frodo's hand, and Frodo's the one holding it. But here, Gandalf, I think, is holding it. I think that's what's being described here. And I find that an interesting choice. I mean, I would think that the ring in this case would like strongly be pulling on Gandalf, and the whole thing is like, don't tempt me to take this ring. I dare not take it. I like it a little better in the film in this case, where he doesn't even, he will refuse to even touch the thing at all. But here he's like holding it and having him look at it. So I don't know, just an interesting difference. Yeah, and then I just took note of the fact that this whole story, the whole story of Gollum, is described here in this chapter. They save this, I mean, big parts of it all the way from movie 3. I think it's the very first scene in Return of the King where Smeagol murders Deagle and takes the ring, right? They're like out there fishing or whatever. Yeah, they saved this part for way later in the film. Again, I can see why. First of all, you don't want to front load this whole story here. You kind of want to reveal Gollum's character over time in the films as you're building kind of the mystery behind that character. Is he going to betray them in the end? Is he, really becoming healed of the influence of the ring? Like, what's going to happen there, right? So you kind of want to build that up over time, and to reveal that he murdered like his best friend the second the ring was found, would sort of put some doubt into that, I believe. But I also had some thoughts just about, well, there was a couple of things in relation to this, right? Like, Frodo and Bilbo come into possession of the ring, and it's not like it immediately has this effect where it's like they're acting way out of character and super aggressive, right? This took, what was it? It's like 60 years before Bilbo was in a state of mind where he would begin to reach for his sword, like we read in the first chapter, when Gandalf started to pressure him to get rid of the ring. 60 years it took before he got to a place where the thought of like fighting or killing his friend would enter his mind. For Smeagol, that happened instantly, and he didn't even have the ring yet. He just was looking at it. Deagle was the one who actually fished it out of the river, and it was like, oh, it's my birthday, you should give that to me. He's like, no, I already gave you presents, like, F off, right? And then Smeagol just murders him right there. I'm not really sure how to articulate this. Like, Smeagol is supposed to be from a people that were some kind of ancestors, like ancient ancestors. I guess not that ancient. It's only really 3,000 years. So evolutionarily speaking, they're actually probably entirely the same. But their cultures would have been a little different. But But Smeagol is basically like an ancestor of modern day hobbits in the Shire, right? And so they share that sort of like biological lineage. And this is sort of used to explain, which I actually really liked, how Gollum and Bilbo in the cave were able to understand each other so quickly and knew a lot of the same riddles to ask each other. And like culturally, I really liked that point that Gandalf makes. Like culturally, they understood each other remarkably well for what appeared to be an orc-like monster deep in the mountains and a hobbit from the Shire, like on this crazy journey, right? For the two of them to meet and just be able to like culturally connect and understand each other as quickly as they did was evidence that Gandalf uses to prove to Frodo that, yes, Smeagol was once something very close to a hobbit or basically an ancestor of your own people. So I really like that detail. But the fact that they share that lineage, yet the ring has this really slow effect on hobbits, and, you know, in particular on Bilbo and Frodo, and Gandalf makes this case for how hobbits are like, just in particular, built in such a way that makes them resistant to the ring in a way that no other race is, right? And that's why the ring is safest with them than it would be with, in particular, with like men of Gondor or even with any elves or something like that, right? Like, and particularly not with a wizard, a powerful Maiar like Gandalf or Saruman or something like that. Like the pull of the ring, the temptation for power is just not something hobbits are after. Yet Smeagol was immediately taken by it and driven to the point of murder before he had even possessed the thing. I feel like there is something in that doesn't quite jive with the shared lineage that he builds up for Smeagol and Bilbo. Why is it that Smeagol was like instantly driven to the most evil thing he could have done just from looking on the thing? Those two things don't entirely jive with me necessarily. Maybe there's an explanation from this from some super Lord of the Rings nerd out there who could, you know, explain it a little bit better. But that was something I was kind of like, I'm not so sure about that. That idea didn't feel like completely baked to me, if that makes sense. If they're so similar, and that this is the reason why Bilbo and Smeagol or Gollum understood each other so well, and also why that's going to happen. This is sort of a foreshadow of Frodo and Smeagol's relationship when they're traveling together in books, you know, well, I guess not books, but in the second novel and third novel, and why he's able to feel pity for him and understand him so well. Why was Smeagol so immediately driven to evil? And is this not necessarily something that applies to just the people, like hobbits as a general sort of race or population, or just, you know, their makeup? But maybe Smeagol was already just kind of a slimy, deceitful person. And so the pull was stronger on him because he already had more darkness in his heart. Like, maybe that's it. But I don't know. It got me thinking a little bit as I read that. Something that wasn't exactly explained, I think, as well as it could have been. And of course, you know, Frodo here is upset and just like disgusted by this story about Gollum. And Gandalf's response, you know, the empathy that he seems to have, I think it is a sad story, said the wizard. And it might have happened to others, even some hobbits that I have known. So that kind of touches on what I'm talking about a little bit. I think there's something there. It's like some hobbits that I've known, you know, maybe the Sackville Bagginses or something like that, right? Maybe that's what it is. Let's say the ring had been discovered by the Sackville Bagginses or something like that. Would they be the type of people who would immediately murder someone to get it, like Smeagol was? Was Smeagol kind of like the Sackville Bagginses of his tribe or whatever? Was he that kind of, you know, again, deceitful, had some darkness in his heart already, was already kind of a bad dude? maybe that's the reason, but that's why I wanted to take that note and touch on that as well.
I can't believe that Gollum was connected with hobbits, however distantly, said Frodo with some heat. What an abominable notion!
It is true all the same, replied Gandalf. About their origins, at any rate, I know more than hobbits do themselves. And even Bilbo's story suggests the kinship. There was a great deal in the background of their minds and memories that was very similar. They understood one another remarkably well, very much better than a hobbit would understand, say, a dwarf or an orc or even an elf. Think of the riddles they both knew, for one thing.
The fact that those two things in particular, the history, sort of the love of history that Tolkien had, and then his love of linguistics, really drove how he developed the story. You can really see that in details like that.
But there was something else in it, I think, which you don't see yet. Even Gollum was not wholly ruined. He had proved tougher than even one of the wise would have guessed, as a hobbit might. There was a little corner of his mind that was still his own, and light came through it, as through a chink in the dark. Light out of the past. It was actually pleasant, I think, to hear a kindly voice again, bringing up memories of wind and trees and sun on the grass and such forgotten things. But that, of course, would only make the evil part of him angrier in the end. Unless it could be conquered. Unless it could be cured.
So that's kind of the question that is being asked here, Can Gollum, after all that's happened, be cured? Can that darkness, that evil in him be conquered? I think it's an interesting question. Of course, it's a big setup for the fact that Frodo's going to be asking this and feel pity for Gollum all through, the Two Towers and Return of the King. But I wonder if, again, the immediate drive to murder didn't already suggest he was a pretty bad guy, right? That he was already pretty evil to begin with. And does he even deserve that chance? I'm kind of with Frodo a little bit on that. Frodo's opinion of him at this point. We'll see how that changes as I read through it and kind of see how he contextualizes this change in Frodo over time as he... Well, I mean, a big part of it is the fact that he's a ring bearer himself and he can feel the influence of the ring on himself, and he can see that in Gollum. He feels some pity for him having been a ring bearer, knowing what he's going through. But there's a difference. There's a big difference between Frodo and Bilbo, how they came across possessing the ring and how well they resisted it versus the way Gollum did. That there is a distinction there, I feel.
A ring of power looks after itself, Frodo. It may slip off treacherously, but its keeper never abandons it. At most, he plays with the idea of handing it on to someone else's care, and that only at an early stage when it first begins to grip. But as far as I know, Bilbo alone in history has ever gone beyond playing and really done it. He needed all my help too, and even so, he would never have just forsaken it or cast it aside. It was not Gollum, Frodo, but the ring itself that decided things. The ring left him.
This is, when this is brought up when Frodo talks about, why not just get rid of it or destroy it? Why didn't you send me a letter? He's like, there's no way that would have happened. Try. Have you tried? Have you tried to destroy it? Go ahead and try. And Frodo takes the ring out as if he's going to throw it in the fire, and he can't make himself do it, right? And this is another thing that gets brought up too. There was more than one power at work, Frodo. So this is talking about the circumstances under which the ring left Gollum. The ring knew nothing's going to happen if I stay here with this Gollum creature. I've got to get out of this mountain. It's been 500 years or whatever. I've got to get back to the hand of my master. I've got to get out of this mountain. So it abandons Gollum on purpose. But the other power that's at work, aside from Sauron's power, the ring's power, was what decided to have Bilbo appear just at the right time to pick it up. And he talks about how that's an encouraging thought, right? There's another power. He's talking, of course, about the Valar or Iluvatar or something like that that's at work. And so it's encouraging to know that it's not just the ring's will or Sauron's will alone that has the power to sort of make these movements and sort of influence things that happen in the world. It's not just the dark power. There's a light power as well. And of course, it's funny the way Frodo dismisses that. It's not an encouraging thought at all. This is crazy. What are you talking about?
Behind that, there was something else at work beyond any design of the Ringmaker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker, in which case you also were meant to have it. And that may be an encouraging thought. It is not.
Frodo ends up asking, okay, so Gollum came after Bilbo. He knows where he lives. He knows he's in the Shire. Why didn't he just follow him all the way here and try to take the ring back? And then Gandalf says,
"Ah," said Gandalf, "now we come to it. I think Gollum tried to. He set out and came back westward as far as the great river. But then he turned aside. He was not daunted by the distance, I am sure. No, something else drew him away. So my friends think, those that hunted him for me."
So Gollum was on his way to track Bilbo down, kill him, and take the ring back. But there was a call from Sauron that drew, or that just naturally draws, evil creatures to him. And Gollum couldn't resist that call. He went to Mordor, not of his own volition, but because he was called there. And he justified this in his mind by saying, okay, I'll make these friends from the, other sort of evil creatures that are coming here, and I'll come get my revenge. But of course, this was also that Sauron could torture and interrogate him and try to find out where this ring is, because he knew it's still out there somewhere, right? And this line is great. This is from the movie too, repurposed for a later scene.
What a pity that Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had a chance.
Pity? It was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end, because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity.
I love the extra context here in the novel version from this line that they took out of the movie. I think it's really important. I'm actually not sure why they took it out for the film version. So, of course, the first part is in there. Pity. It was a pity that stayed his hand, right? Don't be so quick to deal out death in judgment. Can you give it to them, Frodo? That whole part. That's in here too. It's kind of like the next line. Yeah, here it is.
Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends.
But this little part right here, be sure that he took so little hurt from the ring and escaped in the end because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity. So that was the big difference between how slow an influence the ring had on Bilbo versus how quickly it took hold of Smeagol, because Smeagol began his ownership of the ring with a murder. Bilbo began his ownership of the ring by sparing Gollum, by taking pity on him. So, again, I feel like there's a big difference just inherently in their characters. Smeagol was already the kind of person that would kill, I think, in order for the ring to have that sort of immediate influence on him. Bilbo was not. And so Bilbo was already in possession of that ring. He's already got it even, and he won't kill. Even for a reason that seems justified. This creature that's trying to kill me is blocking me from getting out of here. He can't see me. Let me cut him down and leave. Even that, right, which would have felt totally justified, he still didn't kill. And it's because that's how he began his ownership of the ring, that he was able to resist as long as he did. Way longer than Frodo even. So I thought that was a really interesting point and a big difference, not a big difference, but a big point of explanation for the difference in how the ring affected Gollum versus Bilbo. That's important, and I'm really not sure why they left that out of the film. Here's another line that was repurposed for a later part of the film, not the same scene in the caves in Moria later, but this is, I think, in the Council of Elrond. He laid his hand on Frodo's shoulder. I will help you bear this burden as long as it is yours to bear, but we must do something soon. The enemy is moving. And it takes a long time. They kind of sit in silence for quite a while as Frodo is thinking about, how should I handle this situation? What should I do? And in the end, he, of course, decides, okay, I'll take it. I got to take it out of the Shire. I can't stay here, but I got to take it somewhere. Where should I go? Kind of a thing, right? And Gandalf, but he's worried. Frodo is worried that, how is this ring going to influence me? How is it going to affect me long term? The longer that I have this, obviously, it's going to corrupt me, like you're talking about. And Gandalf assures him, whatever it may do, it will be slow to evil if you keep it with that purpose. And then, of course, he hears Sam outside the window eavesdropping, pulls him in, just like in the movie, yells at him about it. I've been dropping no eaves, sir, honest, right? But the difference, actually, and I kind of like this in the novel version a lot, Sam asks, oh, can you please take me to see elves? I want to go see elves so bad. He's kind of built up as somebody who was in love with Bilbo's stories and wanted to go on adventures. I think Sam, in at least the novel version, was a little bit more like Bilbo in that sense than even Frodo was. He was eager to go. Oh, please take me to see elves. Or I want to see them so bad. Please take me with you. And then in the movie, I've thought of a better use for you, is what Gandalf says. He says that here too. And then they kind of just hang ominously on Sam's face as he's responding to that. And then they cut away to Sam and Frodo leaving the Shire together, which is effective for the film. I'm not saying one version or the other is necessarily better here, but I do like in this version how when Gandalf says, I've thought of a better use for you, you will go with Mr. Frodo. And Sam's just like, hooray, this is amazing. And then he bursts into tears and starts crying.
I have thought of something better than that. Something to shut your mouth and punish you properly for listening. You shall go away with Mr. Frodo.
Me, sir? Cried Sam, springing up like a dog invited for a walk. Me? Go and see elves and all? Hooray! He shouted, and then burst into tears.
A really funny little moment that is lost a little bit in the film that I really love from this version. But yeah, and I think this is all kind of set up too for the fact that the quest would have failed without Sam. And that Sam really in his heart is the strongest as far as resisting the ring's pull and being able to do what's necessary to destroy it than Frodo is. And he is more eager to go on an adventure and leave like Bilbo was. I think that Sam in that particular way is closer to the character Bilbo is than Frodo is, which is why in the end Frodo struggles so badly with the influence of the ring towards the end of the journey. Now, there is a big difference between leaving the ring behind in someone else's possession versus knowingly throwing it into, the crack of doom and destroying it. So I'll talk about that later in the story. But I do think that there is an interesting distinction to be made between Frodo and Bilbo as characters. And even in the film, there's a line in Rivendell where Frodo says to Bilbo, I'm not like you, Bilbo, right? I'm ready to go home now. I'm not into this adventuring thing the way that you were, right? This isn't for me the way it was for you. So there's a big distinction between them, and I feel like Samwise is the one who's actually a little bit closer to the ideal ring bearer that Bilbo had been before, as far as resisting its pull, as far as being willing to go out, and this being a big part of what I think sort of the driving theme is. It's that willingness to go, that eagerness to venture forth, that brings the greatest change in a person's character and the most growth in their personal character. And Samwise has more willingness, more eagerness to do that than Frodo does. So I think that's why, for a lot of people, Samwise is not only the stronger character, but the more beloved character by the end of the story than even Frodo is. So that's something I'm going to keep my eye on here. But that's the end of chapter 2. I'll come back again with chapter 3 next time. I'll be traveling next week, but I will actually try to film while I'm gone, even if it just has to be on my phone, something quick about chapter 3. But I'll see you guys next week.